On March 26, 2018, a passenger train leaves Pyongyang, North Korea. 21 bulletproof cars, painted an olive drab, lumber across the countryside. Then, over the Chinese border. Rumors begin throughout the international community. This is the official train of the North Korea leadership, used by Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the grandfather and father of current leader Kim Jong-un. No one outside of the notoriously secretive nation knows who is aboard. Some speculate it is Kim Yo-jong, Un's younger sister and most trusted advisor. It is not until the train reaches its final destination, Beijing, that it is revealed Kim Jong-un, the 34-year-old dictator himself, is the passenger. In the months preceding this meeting, what follows in Beijing, and in the months to come, are the preliminary steps to what may be the most important diplomatic event of our young century. A path to peace on the Korean Peninsula, and a way to bring the North Koreans into the international fold after 70 years of isolation. But the path to peace will be one of twists and turns, as allies and the U.S. jockey for position to protect their interests and maintain security. By the time President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un meet face-to-face in Singapore, it is still unclear what each party wants or will be willing to do. This is the great game. North Korea remains an enigma.
Good morning. How are you, Mr. Vice President? Very nice to see you.
And only those who have sat across the table with North Korean negotiators understand the challenges.
I do believe that they're very tough. They're very well prepared. They read everything, especially media. What makes them so tough, it's not just their culture, but the fact that they have been isolated. They've been sanctioned. They hardly any of them, the citizens, leave North Korea. They have television that's programmed every evening. For 3 hours, the government tells you what you're going to see. And inevitably, they hate the United States.
At the end of the day, diplomacy is really trying to get the other side to do something they don't really want to do. In dealing with another country, make it clear that you make the hard choices today, and I'm not promising you the end of hard choices, but I'm promising you that in the future, you won't have to make them alone.
Mostly, I don't see it as a gift. You usually use diplomacy more with your adversaries than with your friends. And so it is this matter of being prepared and putting yourself into the other country's shoes and figuring out what you do in order to solve the problem. And it's not a gift. It is how you talk to those you disagree with.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, is anything but democratic. From the ashes of World War II loomed the first post-war spread of Soviet communism. In August 1945, the Korean Peninsula and her people were effectively divided at the 38th parallel, an arbitrary divide. Using a National Geographic map, the future U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and fellow Army staffer, Colonel Charles Tick Bonesteel, knew the decision of the 38th parallel made no economic or geographic sense. But with the Cold War about to cast a long shadow, the United States wanted Seoul and the democratic-leaning South under their alliance. Kim Il-sung, the young, charismatic rebel, famous for his insurrection against the brutal, decades-old Japanese occupation, vied for power and shaped this new republic in the Stalinist fashion, adopting a totalitarian reign of terror. Kim solidified his place in the Soviet-backed North, then sought to unify the peninsula by invading the South and starting the Korean conflict on June 25, 1950.
In an air of renewed optimism,
3 years later, a ceasefire was reached. North Korea, a nation established by warfare, will be perpetuated by self-imposed isolation, bloodshed, and humanitarian horrors.
It's the most unique country in the world. What other country in the world is Confucian, communist, hereditary, dynasty? There's no country like this. While it also commits human rights violations, United Nations Commission of Inquiry said there's no other parallel in contemporary history except Nazi Germany, and this is North Korea. I don't think there's another country that's more isolated than North Korea. So, truly a unique place.
And they have been challenging American policy for nearly 70 years.
I think any political question has to start with a map. And when you look at a map of Northeast Asia, it's a pretty compact area. And you're seeing Russian Far East interests right there. You're seeing Japan right there, China, enormous interests right there, South Korea. And then in the middle of this, you have this funny little thing called North Korea. And so how does it affect the countries around it? And I would say it affects them all big time.
North Koreans figured out how to work the United States. So there's usually a provocation of some sort, whether it's a missile test or a nuke test. And then there's international condemnation that follows. And then they sort of up the ante, like a poker game. Oh yeah, here's more. And then sort of we have a collective, oh no. And then they step back and say, okay. And here's what we can do. They have some sort of charm offensive, peace offensive. Then we meet with them, we negotiate, we give them aid, some rewards, some time passes, then back to provocation. So sort of get, provoke and get paid cycle.
For generations, the North Korean people have been controlled by a police state that has perfected propaganda to an art. Their belief in the Kim family dynasty is absolute devotion. Information is tightly controlled by the Korean Central News Agency, the KCNA, established in 1946.
There have obviously been many other deeply repressive communist dictators, Stalin, Mao. They didn't have the technology that the Kim family had. They didn't have the degree of social control. So they didn't have speakers in every village, speakers on the wall of every home to control people. They didn't have television in every home. They didn't even have these portraits of the leaders. It's kind of a religious cult.
It's the deity, it's the leaders, the grandfather, the father, now Kim Jong-un, that are not just political figures, they're godlike religious figures. And what they say determines how North Koreans act.
Kim Jong-un only had a very short amount of time to build his legitimacy within the regime. Kim Jong-il, by comparison, had 30 years to create his legitimacy. Kim Jong-un had none of this. But a lot of things, very interesting things began to happen when Kim Jong-un came to power. The first thing that happened is they had the missile test, which was a failure. But what does North Korea do? They admit it was a failure. Unprecedented. Why did they do that? Gave people pause to think that maybe this was something different. Kim Jong-un laid down the Rosetta Stone of where he wanted to take this regime. People would no longer have to tighten their belts. This was an important statement by Kim Jong-un. There was no mention whatsoever of the nuclear program in that speech, because that's not where Kim Jong-un wanted his legacy. That was Kim Jong-il's legacy, was the nuclear program. His legacy was to create the strong and prosperous nation.
He then created a kind of chaotic situation within the Workers' Party, the North Korean Workers' Party, and actually had his uncle, Chung Sung-taek, perp-walked out of a party meeting and killed the next day. So Kim Jong-un began a series of executions of senior North Korean figures, such that it was hard to find a common denominator of why these people had been executed. But certainly, one can speculate that he didn't feel they were sufficiently loyal to him.
He purges over 400 senior military and ministry leaders publicly, and allegedly has his older half-brother murdered in a Malaysian airport, poisoned by unwitting assassins. But he needs something else to secure the Kim dynasty. Nuclear weapons that could pose a real and present danger to America and her Asian allies.
This would be the launching of the Kim Jong-Un era. He had to show legitimacy. And if he couldn't show legitimacy on the economic realm, he had to show legitimacy in the security realm. And so he began to move very quickly toward developing the nuclear program so that he would have something to hang his hat on. So it will give him a much stronger position in which to negotiate with the United States.
Kim Jong-il moved the nuclear program forward in spite of international outcry and on-again, off-again treaties. Now, it is his son who may finish the job, having a strong hand to negotiate a way for his impoverished nation to have an economic revival.
I think that he does have a good hand to play. I mean, he has, in fact, from his perspective, developed a nuclear potential and missiles to do the delivery on it, and he's managed to scare the whole region into doing something.
Through 2016 to mid-September 2017, Kim Jong-un conducts 3 nuclear tests, including a hydrogen bomb, and 30 short and long-range missile launches, including intercontinental ballistic missiles. Kim claims that they have nuclear warheads small enough to fit on each ICBM.
In 70 years,
in September 2017, President Donald Trump addresses the UN General Assembly.
No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea.
He delivers a fiery speech attacking Kim Jong-un and threatening the destruction of his country.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Trump's rhetoric feeds directly into the North's propaganda machine, that America wants to annihilate North Korea.
I think that was definitely off script. I can't possibly imagine administration officials like Mattis or Secretary Tillerson advocating totally destroying North Korea. I just can't possibly fathom that. So I think that was President Trump speaking.
I think North Korean officials have played a weak hand just brilliantly, while I think the U.S. approach has to some degree backfired. Essentially, the U.S., I think, was trying to intimidate North Korea with some of this rhetoric about fire and fury, about complete destruction. And I think what we actually accomplished was that we terrified South Korea into engaging in diplomacy with North Korea.
I think that it's very hard to really assess what effect President Trump's language had on Kim Jong-un. I don't know whether it scared the Japanese too.
The United Nations Security Council votes for maximum pressure through economic sanctions against the North.
We have kicked the can down the road long enough. There is no more road left.
A war of words between Pyongyang and President Trump begins.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States.
Kim refers to Trump as a mentally deranged dotard. Trump insists his red button is bigger than Kim's. Still, the DPRK tests another ICBM. This one, experts agree, has a range that could hit the continental United States. The U.S. talked openly about a bloody-nose military strike that would cripple nuclear testing sites. Only a handful of experts believed this was a viable solution.
Diplomacy is a hugely inefficient toolbox. It doesn't work very well. But in cases like North Korea, it's all we have to resolve this crisis. Ever since 1969, when North Korea shot down a U.S. aircraft and killed a bunch of Americans, the U.S. has looked for ways to shape North Korean behavior. So repeatedly, you have very smart officials who, when they're out of power, they talk about military options. And then once in power, and they look at the predictions of perhaps 1 million people dying on the very first day of a war with North Korea, then they think, well, okay, maybe this isn't the best option, and they look at what's left. And what's left is diplomacy.
Adding to the growing anxiety on the peninsula, South Korea was preparing the 2018 Olympic Games, and there was precedent to feel insecure. 30 years earlier, in 1988, South Korea's first Olympics were being planned. The supreme leader, Kim Il-sung, set out to create a chaotic atmosphere to keep people away from the Games.
Investigators now believe that a bomb, possibly planted by 2 passengers, may have caused Sunday's crash of a Korean airliner.
They downed a civilian airliner, killed 115 people on board. It was a major terror attack. That was the reason why the United States put North Korea in the state sponsor of terror list. And it also shows you just the brutality and just the insanity because they downed a civilian airliner, killing 115 people on board just to disrupt the Olympics that was going to be held in South Korea.
The DPRK was banned from competition, but the Games went on, a huge coming out party. A turning point for Seoul as it pulled further away from the North politically, economically, and culturally. It only fueled the rivalry between the two Koreas. Then, on New Year's Day 2018, Kim Jong-un gives a speech as tensions on the Korean peninsula reach a searing point.
번터 전역이 우리의 핵 타격 사정권 안에 있으며 핵 단추가 내 사무실 책상 위에 항상 놓여 있다는 것, 이는 결코 위협이 아닌 현실임을 똑바로 알아야 합니다. 겨울철 올림픽 경기대회에 대해 말한다면 그것은 민족의 위상을 과시하는 좋은 계기로 될 것이며 우리는 대회가 성과적으로 개최되기를 진심으로 바랍니다. 이러한 견지에서 우리는 대표단 파견을 포함하여 필요한 조치를 취할 용의가 있으며
At first, I think there was a considerable or a preponderance of views to the effect that this is all an effort to create wedges between the United States and South Korea. It's also an effort, really, to show South Korea that North Korea can be a good neighbor, even if it has nuclear weapons.
This olive branch was heard around the world. Moon Jae-in invites the North to march together at the Games.
I can understand what President Moon is trying to do now in terms of they are living there in this very dangerous area. And these issues, and they're much more complicated than just one issue like missiles. It's their way of life.
The North Korean delegation arrived at the Olympic Games, led by Kim's younger sister and closest confidant, Kim Yo-jong. Her presence captivated the South Koreans. Part curiosity, part relief that she appeared so poised and confident.
North Koreans won on that whole image makeover contest. Kim Yo-jong was called Ivanka of the Kim administration. She was hugely popular in South Korea. She seemed human, she seemed normal, she was charming, she was smiling.
We'll be telling the truth about North Korea at every stop.
The American delegation, led by Vice President Pence, held talks with the North Korean defectors, implored the South to ignore overtures from the North, met with the family of Otto Warmbier, the University of Virginia student who died soon after being released from a North Korean prison in a coma, and avoided a state dinner so not to be with the DPRK delegation. During the opening ceremonies, the body language could not be more evident, as Pence sat stone-faced.
Then when the joint team walked in, it's not only North Korean Olympians. There were South Korean Olympians that were walking in. You can stand up. You can stand up and cheer because it's your ally. Your South Korea is hosting the Olympics, and you're seeing the South Korean athletes also coming in with the North Korean athletes. So you should stand up and be welcoming. I didn't think we scored any kind of points on that image front.
It's on this visit that Kim Yo-jong hand-delivers a letter from her brother, inviting President Moon to meet him in person. Washington watches.
President Moon is somebody that is regarded more as a liberal within their system, had come forward with the idea that there needed to be more cooperation. I also do think that there are those who believe in the crazy man theory, that some of the threats that President Trump made, I think it's conceivable, had some role in changing the mind of the North Koreans. But I think the question is, what happens next?
Both Washington and Seoul agreed to keep up the diplomatic momentum that began since the new year. And President Moon Jae-in sends a 10-member delegation to Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un calls the 4-hour meeting an open-hearted talk, actively improving the North-South relations and ensuring peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Washington remains skeptical, saying that the South should not normalize relations with the North without discussion of denuclearization.
We remain determined to achieve a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
But President Moon, like a matchmaker, persuades the North and the U.S. to soften their positions, insisting that the two initiatives move in parallel, urging the U.S. to start talks with the DPRK. Kim Jong-un says he will put denuclearization of the peninsula on the table. And 3 days later, Moon's diplomats are at the White House carrying a letter from Chairman Kim.
President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May to achieve permanent denuclearization.
The first time a sitting American president will meet face-to-face with a leader of North Korea.
Of the Korean Peninsula.
Many in the diplomatic community are surprised and concerned. An unconventional president meeting an unpredictable dictator as equals. A president known more for behaving on instinct than precedent, who shuns preparation or study, speaking directly with a famously thin-skinned, impulsive dictator. All while the White House is embroiled in multiple scandals, a growing global trade war, and the U.S. State Department and National Security Team are in flux. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is soon fired by Trump. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster resigns afterward.
The issue is how prepared President Trump will be for it. Usually, a summit meeting takes place towards the end of negotiations, where the president can then come in and kind of put the last stone in and really add some piece to it, but not having done kind of the building of the whole thing. And so it will take incredible discipline.
If it fails, if one of them walks out in a huff, if one of them suggests, no, we can't do this, then where are you going to go? Because you've already put in your closer. And your closer, your leaders, should be able to kind of nail down the last two issues that are out there. So instead, you have your leaders starting the process.
I think they're both very much alike. They're autocratic, they're unpredictable, and it could come out a decent outcome, but we're unsure. And I've said to the Trump administration, the gamble of talking to Kim Jong-un is a huge gamble, but I think it's the right gamble. But be prepared. They're relentless. If we're not prepared, we don't have our act together, we put up unrealistic expectations, they're going to outsmart us.
The wheels are literally in motion.
I've seen that train. Nobody else can ride in that train. The good news is that he's starting to talk to other leaders.
It's March 27th, 2018. Kim has not traveled outside of the DPRK since he assumed power in 2011, and he has yet to meet with another head of state.
They're going to China to ask for something, and that's diplomacy. That's, you know, you get squeezed, you do something. And this is a rational actor, Kim Jong-un, taking these steps. I believe. I'm not sure. I'm not there, but this is what he's probably doing.
1 month before he meets with Moon, Chairman Kim, in a surprise move, arrives in Beijing to meet President Xi Jinping for the first time.
I think he was doing a couple of things. I think he was trying to get some sort of sanctions relief, some sort of see where China is in all of that, assure China that China's interests will be protected. But I think also took an opportunity to sort of showcase himself as a leader. I think he really used it to normalize his image as a normal leader of a normal country, a modern leader of a modern nation. Here he brought his very young, attractive wife and other senior North Korean officials, spent 4 days with President Xi. And there's President Xi, his wife, Kim Jong-un, his attractive wife, drinking, laughing, talking. So it's just a great image makeover for Kim. And I think he was very smart to have done that.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe meets with Trump to assure Japan's interests are not in peril. And President Trump confirms that then CIA chief Mike Pompeo met secretly with Kim Jong-un 2 weeks earlier on Easter weekend, beginning the planning process of the Trump-Kim summit.
He just left North Korea, had a great meeting with Kim Jong-un, and got along with him really well, really great.
Pompeo is poised to become Secretary of State, and hardliner former UN Ambassador John Bolton is appointed National Security Advisor. One week before Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in meet, North Korea declares it will halt all nuclear and long-range missile tests. And as Kim shifts national focus to the North's economy, he says he will shut down one of his nuclear test sites. President Trump tweets, "This is very good news for North Korea and the world. Big progress." Now on the table is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and discussion of a peace treaty, officially ending the Korean War, which concluded with only an armistice, ceasing 70 years of hostility. The Panmunjom Truce Village traverses both North and South Korea, inside the demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel. Here, President Moon and Chairman Kim meet for the first time on April 27, 2018. Kim becomes the first North Korean leader to ever set foot in the South. The optics show a warm and congenial burgeoning relationship.
Well, it was really interesting to watch Kim Jong-un in terms of body language, his voice, how he was handling himself. He's nothing like his father, who actually was a very big introvert and was not social. He looked like Kim Il-sung to me, his grandfather. He was warm, he was effusive, he was touchy-feely, almost affectionate. He laughed wholeheartedly. So he came across as actually a charming person, a social person who can engage with people, laughing and joking. So all of that was very interesting to me as a Korea watcher.
The day-long summit ends with a pledge to formally end the Korean War and a declaration to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Another date is set to start negotiations in mid-May. But fast-moving events in the coming months begin to raise the stakes of whether a summit with Kim and Trump will even happen. The next day, Trump holds a campaign-style rally in Macomb County, Michigan.
Very well. I spoke to the president this morning of South Korea for a long time. They just had a very good meeting. He gives us tremendous credit. He gives us all the credit. One of the fake news groups this morning now they were saying, what do you think President Trump had to do with it? I'll tell you what. Like, how about everything?
Once the South Koreans thought of Donald Trump as much of a danger as Kim Jong-un. But now, for months, they have been thanking Trump for making the start of a reconciliation possible. Some believe it's to appeal to his ego and maintain the momentum of the talks. President Moon tells his senior secretaries, President Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize. What we need is only peace.
There are a lot of leaders who I think are playing Trump in terms of understanding that if they flatter him, that they make an impression.
The Nobel Peace Prize? Yes, sir. Well, I just think that President Moon was very nice when he suggested it. I want to get peace. The main thing, we want to get peace.
North Korean officials start to take offense that the president is taking all the credit to help bring peace to the region. They claim the sanctions were not responsible for Kim coming to the negotiating table, and Washington is ruining the mood leading up to the peace talks.
It's not all just U.S. maximum pressure strategy that led to this point. I think Kim Jong-un himself had a strategy. Now he's get to sit down with the President of the United States for the first time. It shows that Kim Jong-un is a different kind of leader. He has shown himself to be bold and astute and quite smart, actually.
I think
Then, John Bolton, the new national security advisor, who favors military action and regime change with hostile nations, appears on CBS's Face the Nation.
The requirement that Kim Jong-un agree to give away those weapons before you give any kind of concession.
I think that's right. I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003, 2004. We're also looking at what North Korea itself has committed to previously.
North Koreans love to use Libya as an example of why they must keep nuclear weapons. They repeatedly say, look what happened to Gaddafi. Gaddafi gave up nuclear weapons, then the West helped the revolt against Gaddafi, and now Gaddafi is dead. So when North Koreans hear John Bolton say we're pursuing a Libyan model, I think this is not helpful because North Koreans they were afraid of becoming another Libya.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo arrives in Pyongyang a second time to discuss the summit. This time, he returns with 3 Americans that were jailed in North Korea for crimes against the state. It's believed to be a goodwill gesture by Kim.
And actually, even before becoming...
As the U.S. confers with anxious allies in the region, Kim too makes another surprise trip to Beijing.
There's multiple and overlapping interests, and not all of them are aligned. It's very complicated. I speculate that Kim Jong-un was showing Xi Jinping what a deal with the United States might look like and what does China think of it. Because you really need China's buy-in. Meanwhile, our ally Japan is very unhappy how things are unfolding, even though they can't really quite say it, because they are so worried that the United States is going to make a deal with North Korea that protects U.S. interests. South Korea is trying to be sort of an honest broker, intermediary, but is sort of worried that everything's going to blow up. So there's a lot going on with different countries trying to seek their own interests.
Meanwhile, President Trump fulfills a campaign promise and pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal amid protests by our European allies. Many speculate what this would signal for the upcoming summit with the DPRK.
It would be an interesting point of conversation, frankly, if Kim Jong-un said to President Trump, we've looked at the Iran deal, and you say it's the worst deal ever. Why do you say it's the worst deal ever? Because I'm not sure we can reach a deal that's anywhere as good as the Iran deal from your perspective, Mr. President. So I think the president is going to have to make some attitudinal changes about the Iran deal in a way that will help if there is a prospect of a North Korean deal.
Wrinkles begin to appear as the DPRK starts reading into statements coming out of Washington.
Diplomacy is not Twitter or Facebook or press releases or cable news. Diplomacy is human beings talking to each other and reaching an agreement, showing respect for culture, letting the other side save face, letting the other side save credit, building relationships. That's diplomacy.
The North releases a statement rejecting Bolton's Libya model claim. Referring to him as repugnant, they say they will never completely disarm. That, combined with a joint South Korean and American military exercise along the border of the North, is enough for the North to cancel the next inter-Korean talks and puts the Trump-Kim summit at risk. To save his summit with Kim, President Trump begins to backpedal on Bolton's statement.
Well, the Libyan model isn't a model that we have at all when we're thinking of North Korea. But if we make a deal, I think Kim Jong-Un is going to be very, very happy. I really believe he's going to be very happy. But this is just the opposite. And I think when John Bolton made that statement, he was talking about if we're going to be having a problem, because we cannot let that country have nukes. We just can't do it.
With 3 weeks to the historic summit set for June 12, 2018 in Singapore, the tension once again rises. And President Moon makes a trip to Washington in the hope he can save the talks. To North Korean experts, this is no surprise. The idea of Kim giving up his nuclear arsenal wholesale in exchange for economic relief was always a non-starter. They want their own security assured.
They'll look for some sort of security agreement, quite possibly asking us not to have any more exercises with the South Koreans. Potentially, they could ask us to remove troops, or potentially they could ask us to reduce our nuclear arsenal.
After meeting with Moon, Trump says he can live with a slower path to denuclearization, reversing his earlier demand for immediate disarmament. It is now that events begin at a frantic pace. The South Korean leadership predicts a 99.9% chance of the summit continuing. But the North picks up on statements made by Vice President Pence.
You know, there was some talk about the Libyan model last week. And, you know, as the president made clear, you know, this will only end like the Libyan model ended if Kim Jong-un doesn't make a deal.
Some people saw that as a threat.
Well, I think it's more of a fact.
The North Koreans had only harsh words, calling the vice president a political dummy, and continued, whether the U.S. will meet us at a meeting room or encounter us at nuclear-to-nuclear showdown is entirely dependent upon the decision of the U.S.
The nuclear program is intimately tied into two primary objectives for Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. One is the survival of the regime, and two is the perpetuation of the Kim family rule. And the nuclear program is intimately tied into that.
The next morning, Trump blindsides the two Koreas and abruptly cancels the summit, expressing tremendous anger and open hostility on North Korea's part. But he leaves the door open to future talks.
I believe that this is a tremendous setback for North Korea and indeed a setback for the world.
2 days later, Chairman Kim and President Moon meet at the Truce Village. They agree to hold frequent discussions. As the clock ticks, American and North Korean officials hold back-channel meetings. the North openly states they are willing to continue with the summit. President Trump thanks Chairman Kim for a solid response to his letter and says the White House is preparing for talks on June 12th.
We're gonna see what happens.
President Trump tweets, "We have put a great team together for our talks with North Korea. Meetings are currently taking place concerning summit and more."
There's no way to describe to anybody how long it takes to have these kind of talks and how much preparation has to come from it. And also what the relationship is with the allied countries.
Now, an event that would normally take months or years to arrange is happening in days. Mike Pompeo meets in New York City to discuss the path to denuclearization with Vice Chairman Kim Jong-un, the DPRK's top nuclear negotiator. And in Pyongyang, Kim meets with Russia's foreign minister with an invitation to come to Moscow, raising concerns with the White House. President Trump tweets, "Our United States team has arrived in North Korea to make arrangements for the summit between Kim Jong-un and myself. I truly believe North Korea has brilliant potential."
It has been incredibly frustrating, and North Korea has lied to us, has cheated us. We indeed have likewise not fulfilled some of our obligations to North Korea. But the last best hope of trying to resolve some of these issues is going to be to rely on diplomacy. There's no other way, there's no alternative to try to resolve this crisis except to try to negotiate a better one.
After talks with Pompeo, Kim Jong-chol arrives at the White House, carrying a letter from Kim Jong-un. The first time a North Korean dignitary visited there since 2000. After 2 hours, President Trump and Vice Chairman Kim Jong-chol emerge from the White House.
You people are going to have to travel because you'll be in Singapore on June 12th. And I think it'll be a process. It's not, I never said it goes in one meeting. I think it's going to be a process. But the relationships are building, and that's a very positive thing.
2 weeks later, after a bruising G7 summit, Trump is accused of further alienating traditional allies. He leaves for Singapore, confident that he can forge a new relationship with a traditional adversary, insisting he doesn't need a lot of preparation.
The whole concern about the summit was the idea that they were essentially going to do it with very little preparation, and the president was going to trust his instincts. That's one problem. The second problem is sometimes his instincts are wrong. And so that's where you need to have a lot of preparation. So they essentially went in with very little preparation, and they certainly didn't have any agreement on the overall issue of denuclearization, except that North Korea said they're in favor of it.
In Singapore, a media frenzy begins as over 2,500 reporters gather. Chairman Kim arrives aboard a Chinese state airliner. Some say it's a message from Xi Jinping that the DPRK is his vassal. Tread lightly. The Prime Minister of Singapore meets with Kim. And everywhere he travels, he's treated with rock star status. An international pariah now looked upon as a statesman who may bring peace to a nervous region. President Trump arrives on Air Force One. After a state lunch, he remains in his hotel for the night.
The President is fully prepared for the meeting tomorrow. I have personally had the opportunity to make sure that he's had a chance to hear lots of different voices, all of the attendant opportunities and risks, and that we have put these two leaders in the right place.
In stark contrast, Kim seemingly relishes the attention as he tours the streets of the city. Next morning, June 12th, the flag-draped stage is set for the historic handshake as the two leaders meet at 9:04 a.m. for the first time. They will speak one-on-one with only interpreters in the room for 45 minutes.
Probably the thing I worried about the most was when he was going in one-on-one, because he's not terribly well-rooted in some of the issues, and I thought maybe he'd get spun around on that. And we still don't know what he agreed to.
We will solve it. We will be successful. And I look forward to working on it with you. It will be done.
After a working lunch, the two emerged to address an anxious global community.
Signing a very important document, pretty comprehensive document, and we've had a really great term together, a great relationship.
The analysis is that though the meeting was historic, the details of the agreement were vague at best. Trump spent much time flattering Kim, elevated him to status of an equal, and in a move that blindsided South Korea, Japan, and the Pentagon, Trump agreed to halt U.S.-led military exercises on the peninsula, potentially weakening any military response.
What was signed was an agreed statement, but when you read the text of the agreed statement, there's a lot less there than meets the eye, certainly less than was agreed back in 2005. I think they're going to need another statement, or better yet, maybe ignore what was done in Singapore and just start building something as the Secretary of State begins the very necessary diplomacy.
The hard work of keeping the North engaged begins. And it could draw out well beyond the Trump administration date of 2020. But for now, the threat of war has been hushed.
This problem is not going to be solved with just the U.S. and North Korea. We need to be talking to the Chinese, we need to be talking to the South Koreans, and of course we need to be talking to the Japanese as well.